country. To give you an example, if you were to stay in an inn near Orval, the Trappist monastery of Orval, which is in the south in the Ardennes, so it's in the far south of Belgium, and although certainly not the far east, but it's in one corner of Belgium, so to speak, and then drive through the day, get up in the morning, have your breakfast, and by the evening you could be, say, in Bruges or in the area around the West Flat Run Abbey, which is kind of the other corner of Belgium. So it's not a very large country. And like everywhere, you had first people brewing in their homes. And the commercial brewing was not as prominent in so those are what are referred to as the lowlands. So in the Netherlands, the more commercial brewing was to the north. However, by, of course, about 750, so we're talking 1400 years ago, monasteries began brewing, and they were the center of knowledge, the center of all knowledge. And so they were at the forefront of brewing at the time. The beers they made, we don't know exactly what they were like, but it's important to realize of the 6 monastery breweries in Belgium, every one of their recipes has been modified, modernized, and a lot of times created from the beginning since World War II. So they don't go back centuries and centuries into what they are. So what you regionally, though, you began to get some brewing differences. So you had by probably before that, maybe in the 18th century, certainly in the 19th century, you had the spontaneous beers made near Brussels, and then the east of Brussels you had the wheat beers, which also what we refer to as wit beer now, and those at the time sometimes were spontaneous, and they certainly were always a mixed culture and somewhat sour. Down towards France, you had the saisons, and which were influenced by certainly the fact those were agricultural regions, and then also what the water was like there. So you had all of these they were definitely regional differences within the country. So as a matter of fact, and I may be jumping a little bit here when talking about Brew Like a Monk, but at 20 years ago, Phil Markowski, who's now the brewer at Two Roads in Connecticut, at the time was a brewer at Southampton Public House on Long Island, New York. He proposed writing a book on all of Belgian beers, which was a very bold idea for somebody who was also busy making beer. And Ray Daniels, who wrote Designing Great Beers, was the publisher of Brewers Publications. And now Ray has since left that, and he started, those of you who know the Cicerone program. So Ray started that and is the director, head, founder, all those things of the Cicerone program. And he looked at how long it might take for somebody to write that book and decided to break it into 3 parts. And those parts were the farmhouse ales that Phil wrote, which he was really interested in, and then the wild brews, which looked at spontaneous beers, but also things like the Flanders Reds, all the beers under mixed fermentation that Jeff Sparrow wrote. And then the other book was to be about the Abbey and Trappist beers, and Tommy Arthur at Lost Abbey was going to write that book. But that was about the time, at the time, Tommy was at Pizza Port Brewing, but they were about ready to start Lost Abbey, and he recognized that he just did not have time to write a book. And so that's why it fell on to me to end up writing that particular book. But the fact that you would divide those into those multiple categories within the country sort of showed you the diversity and then how they evolved differently historically.
So that's very interesting because the style word it's very new as well. So how does Belgian brewers feel when you try to categorize them into some styles?
Well, certainly for me, when I wrote this book, I waded right into that controversy, which continues today with the idea of when we describe a beer and we say historically, we'll point, the simplest one is we can point to the Pilsner style, which was from the town of Pilsen in the Czech Republic. And in fact, the other pale lagers to this day in the Czech Republic do not describe themselves as Pilsner. The only Pilsner is Pilsner Urquell from Pilsen. So that's a rather specific, we say, this is what a Czech Pilsner is, and we keep going back to 1840. But these beers evolve over time. So in fact, it's Michael Jackson, the English beer writer, is the first one to, in modern times, beers were named before, and they might have been named, if you think about it, if you know the style Goza, and that became famous, and what we look back to say we want to make it in that style was in Leipzig, but it originates in the town of Goslar. So which had like, it's a tiny little town. It had like 400 breweries, which probably means those were all homes that were licensed to brew, but there might only been a few brew houses in town, and then they shared the rest of them. So specifically, you say that was the beer that was made there at the time. But Michael's the one who gave us those trees, and he had a great story, and we talked before everybody else got here about his Great Beers of Belgium club, and he loved those Belgian beers. He wrote the book Great Beers of Belgium, and updated it 6 times. So we're 7 different editions of that book, just adding on, learning more about it, and things like that. And the story, and when he was promoting the club in the United States, Michael Jackson's Great Beers of Belgium Club, and that was a beer they would be import. The beer that you were drinking, the Petrus Pale, was one of the beers in that club. And when he was talking to people to get them interested in Belgian beers, he told a great story about styles. And it's like he would say that, you go to a German brewer, who of course he would call Fritz, and say, how do you make a Pilsner? And he would say, well, you use Pilsner malt, you use 3470 yeast, and noble hops. You get down to the road to another German brewer and you ask him, how do you make a German Pilsner? And he would say the exact same thing. You would go to a British brewer and ask, how you make a bitter? And they might change something a little bit, like they had a preference for a different kind of malt, or they were using their house yeast, which was not exactly the same. But what he said was that if you go to a Belgian brewer and ask him, how you make your beer, he would say, first of all, you take 1 ton of batch droppings, then you add a black witch. You would go to the next brewer and he would say, the brewer down the road would say, no, you use a white witch. At which point he said, Belgium is a nation of tremendous individualists. That's kind of an overstatement. And I think that as Belgian brewers have exported more of their beer, because much of they're specialists, and not everybody in Belgium wants to dread that. That the best-selling style in Belgium is. You want to fill in the
Uh,
blank? The best-selling style in
I
Belgium is Pilsner.
oh,
So it's a Pilsner drinking
it was
country.
yeah.
Yeah.
I should have known that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. And so they will call their beers by styles because it's easier to sell them. But the but there can be a wide range of differences within the style. And with, at least with some styles in the United States, people have become more comfortable with that as well.
So even though you already said that after World War II, the way they were making beer changed. So we know for sure that in the past 10 years, they changed even more. Like we know that some monasteries are even buying a stainless steel equipment. So how would you describe the evolution of Belgian beers in the last 10 years?
But I think that within the Trappist monasteries, there are very few changes. Koningshaven in the Netherlands does make a wit beer, but there they remain much the same. And you don't casually change a recipe within the Belgian to get that Trappist seal to introduce. So there is now in the United States and Massachusetts, Spencer, Massachusetts, there is a Trappist monastery brewery. To get approval of the first beer they put out, they get a Trappist seal. What they had to do was they have to fill out 17 pages of paperwork that say exactly this is how we make the beer, and then they take it to a meeting with representative of all the other monasteries, and they taste the beer and they say if this is okay. For any Trappist beer to get that seal, they're going to taste that beers and they're going to talk about the process, and they're talking about not fundamentally changing the process. Now, Spencer makes other beers that don't have the Trappist seal. So, for instance, they make an IPA, they make a pumpkin beer, but those are put out without the Trappist seal. But within Belgium itself, it's like every place else in the world. There are lots more small breweries with lots of kits, and they really don't want to feel stifled by what they think of as tradition. So, yep, they're using more American hops in everything. They're doing different kinds of blending and ingredients beyond the traditional. I'm not saying I just want to do a Flanders Red. You know, they are doing many things that the rest of the people do in the world. My friend Jeff Allworth, who wrote the Beer Bible, still sees a definite difference between the Belgians and brewers in the United States. In the United States, you know, what's emerged is hop-forward beers and the way Americans use hops. You know, the Belgians still have a distinct respect for balance. Not all of them are making balanced beers, and where yeast is viewed as a more important component in the beer. We're not going to talk about hoppy beers today, but I think what's also going on in the United States is a greater understanding of the role yeast plays in the interaction with hops, where people are beginning to understand you're not going to get these odor compounds from your hops without the help of yeast as well. That's kind of a different description, but I think where in Belgium, fermentation character, just the fermentation character that you get from the interaction of yeast and malts still plays a bigger role.
Sure. So, what do you think that the breweries in Belgium think about the styles from outside Belgium? Like, do they like them? Do they like to, um, experiment with some of those types of styles? And the other way around, do they think about breweries from outside Belgium try to create styles based on Belgium styles?
Well, not every brewer embraces change. So some of them don't care for what they see going on. And generally they refer to it as from America, but it could be from the Czech Republic, probably not from Germany. There's not as much experimentation there. It could be from South America. but a lot of brewers are also intrigued, and are interested in using American hops, are interested in using and seeing what goes on with other ingredients. So you know, I've talked to them, and the ones that have you know, are a little bit familiar with Brazilian fruits, for instance, would be really like to be able to get those fruits fresh and see what they could do with those. So they're willing to embrace ingredients that are not indigenous to Belgium, but within the same sense of doing it well and not outlandish.
Hmm. And the other way around, like the breweries from, I don't know, the US trying to make the doubles or triples.
Um, it's uh, we're talking Brew Like a Monk's been around 15 years. A lot of people bought the book. I appreciate that. A lot of people come up and tell me how much they like the book, and then they'll hand me their beer, and I wonder if they've read the book. You know, we'll talk about quad a little bit different later, I think, because that would be a complaint that certainly I've heard from many Belgians, that the Americans make their beer a lot more alcoholic and not nearly attenuated enough, so not dry enough. And the tricky thing is, when you tell them you should dry your beer out more, they quite often also don't lower the starting gravity, so then it becomes even more alcoholic. Which is not, I mean, West Malt Triple is 9.6%. It's a pretty big, strong beer, but it doesn't you know, have those higher alcohols that give you a headache the next morning. So I think it's a combination of Americans like bold and brash beers, and then also they haven't tasted enough of those beers that are well made, so they begin to understand what they're doing, and I think that's a challenge, and I know that's a challenge to brewers in South America, getting those beers fresh and tasting them what they're meant to taste like, where they're not oxidized
Yeah.
and old.
Well, that's interesting. For me, it's always had been a thing that why would a brewer try to clone a style rather than just try to get to know what it tastes like the profile. So I do maybe I just want to make a beer that have characteristics like a Belgian one, but I don't want to really replicate one. So
I like your attitude. As I've always said, I would be happy to do these books without sample recipes. And I'm not a clone fan at all. So you can take inspiration, and you want to know exactly the more you can learn about how the flavors end up in the beer, that allows you to make those little changes, as opposed to if somebody just hands you a recipe and says do this exact, go A, B, C, D, and something went wrong at C, you can't get to D. But if you know how it works, then you know how to get there anyway.
yeah. So that's it's funny because right now it's a lot of things going on that normally people get upset if they go to the bar and just they and see one beer published like a red ale and they say, okay, so we are past the time that we just talk about colors. But hey, what if the brewer just don't want to establish that he's trying to clone a particular style, because that's what people are thinking of. They want to know, okay, this is a red, but what red? It's a British amber or whatnot, you know?
Well, it can be useful to have some parameters and have an idea of what it's going to taste like. But without being slavish, to go back when we talked about styles, to say, okay, if this is an alt beer, it's supposed to be just like this, and it has to sit within all of these. And people many times are judging beers that that they at best had one example of the style, and they haven't had many examples of how people make it in the other countries. When you drink them in the other countries, you begin to understand. I believe that's before we started with people coming in, when we were talking about Hefeweizen. You go to Bavaria and you drink a cross section of those beers, and you realize that the amount of banana in some compared to others is very different. The amount of clove is very different. The wheat mouthfeel is different. And then if you go to Bamberg and all of a sudden it's a smoked beer, then it totally throws you. And these are all valid examples of the style, and you realize it's a much broader range. So in learning about this beers, I think it's good to think about all the representatives.
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful topic. It's just about how well are we trained in our senses. So we brew what we think we want to brew, just in the end when we actually taste our product and be sure that we reach what we wanted to brew.
Mm-hmm.
Or mix. We talked about that before. Yeah. So do you think that some things have changed after Brew Like a Monk? Like, have you seen some response
In
from
terms of
brewers?
in terms of Trappist and Abbey beers, not particularly. Um, uh, if I could go back and make a change in the book, I would talk, and it's true in the rest of the world, is the availability of the dark syrups that the which is they're referred to as sometimes as candy syrups with an I. And the key thing though is they are different. So if you get what were called candy sugar, which are still sold in homebrew shops, and that are chunks of brown sugar, those are just brown sugar, and they are not the same as the candy syrup that say that West Flatburn uses, that Westmalle uses, that Rochefort uses, and they get those from confectionery. So candy makers and bakers, and that's the source. That was not available in the United States when my book came out. It became available because an entrepreneur says, well, I want to do a product like this. So I said, this is where you go to get it. And he started importing it. You can make those at home. There is a recipe in the book. I would not recommend trying to make them if you're at above, say above 1,500 meters, because it's just really hard to do it on a stove. You can, but you need a double boiler. But you can make your own dark syrup, and it is integral to making those beers. So, but that would be, if you just want to make the beers like in Trappist Abbeys, very little has changed. What's changed is what we talked about before in Belgium is, experiment. We always thought of Belgium as being experimental, but I don't know that they were really that experimental. They were just different. But people are now willing to use different hop varieties. They're making hazy IPAs and all of those sorts of things. So they've been introduced to flavors from the rest of the world, and they're seeing what they can do with them, sometimes with maybe a Belgian twist, and sometimes just like you'd find elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. So, well, now that we are talking a little bit about Brew Like a Monk, would you tell us the motivation behind writing that book?
Well, as I said earlier, I was uh, in this case, so Ray Daniels he had an advisory committee. I was on the advisory committee, and if you own Designing Great Beers, you'll notice there's nothing about Belgian beers in it. And I always told him, I said, that's what you're missing in the portfolio. Not, I'm a journalist. I wrote about the business of beer, the people involved in beer, 2 guides to bars and brew pubs across the United States. And I was not interested in writing technical books for brewers. But when Tommy Arthur decided he couldn't do the book, Ray called me up and he said, I'm looking for suggestions for people to do it. And I suggested a couple brewers, Rob Todd at Allagash being one of them. I said, I don't know. I know they're making these beers. I don't know if they want to write about them. And then we got to the end of the conversation. He said to me, he thought I would want to write the book because I thought he should add it to designing great beers. And that was not true. I would be happy to somebody else go out and do the research and make it easier for me to make those beers. And I told him I'm just not really interested in writing for brewers. And I hung up the phone and I walked out. My wife is in the kitchen. And I said to her, you won't believe what Ray just suggested, that I write this book on Trappist and Abbey beers. And she looked at me and said, so this means we get to go to Belgium, right? And I said, I guess I'm calling it back. So that's why I wrote the book. And for a model to approach it, I took the approach he took in designing great beers, which was but not totally. But to think about the history of the beers, and then the classic examples of the beers, and then find some other people, the modern people making the beers, which in this case were somewhere in Belgium, more than the United States, because this is a book for American brewers, and then also how home brewers are making the beer. So you had many different components, but the way he did it, it made the organization much easier. And then at least I could envision how to approach it. So that's how I came to write the book.
So you talk about that book, Designing Great Beer. I'm just gonna say that it's a wonderful book. It's I would put it one of the best 4 books that a brewer or home brewer should read. It really has a lot of good information, and it's very
yes.
well.
I think it has a ton of good information. It'd be really nice to have it updated at this point because we know a lot more.
Yeah. And it was a weird thing that there was no chapter about Belgian beers.
Yeah. Well, Jeff Sparrow's theory at the time was Ray didn't, the sour beers upset his stomach, and therefore he wasn't going to write about them. I don't think that's necessarily true. It's just, part of it is, Ray went to Siebel, and you look at a classic brewing education at the time, and it came from English and German styles. That's what people learned. You look at the largest brewer in the United States, Anheuser-Busch, into the 80s, they still spoke German in the brewery. I mean, not all the time, but many people did speak German, and they put things out. It was a lot of either German or Anglo heritage. And so that's the history we had. And that German had been translated, the English, we knew English, but nobody was translating the Belgian stuff. So we really didn't have that clear look at the Belgian history.
So what about the process of researching for this book? Maybe some people would think that Belgians are a little bit closed about speaking their secrets.
Well, we got some of that from Pierre Celis of Celis White, because he would tell people that he had a secret spice in the white beer, but then he would always change what it was, or he wouldn't tell them what it was. And he was a little guy, kind of a elfish thing, and I think that appealed to people. And then other Belgians, maybe they wouldn't say what they were doing. And I saw that when I went to places other than the monastery breweries. They wouldn't hand me the recipe, but I just kept on asking them the questions, and they kept answering the questions. So it was pretty easy when you could, they would tell you not the amounts, but the exact, the grain bill, what the ingredients were. And of course, we knew what their yeast were, because, the sources are basically their yeast, although in the case of Westvleteren and Ockel, we're both using Westmalle yeast, but you knew that they went to Westmalle to get the yeast. You could get the water profiles very easily, and they were telling you the hops they were using. Then you could analyze the beer. You knew this. They would give you the starting gravity. So in Belgium, at least at the time, the taxman always had the right to come into the brewery and look at the books and see the original gravity of every beer. So you think of those Belgian monastery breweries as being some sort of secret places. There was a tax guy that had a key that could come into Westvleteren and look exactly at their recipe. So you had the starting gravity, the finishing gravity of the beer. When I asked them about their mashing regimes, they would tell me exactly what they did. When I asked them about pitching temperature and pitching rates, they just told me. So basically what happened is I asked the questions, they answered the questions. I didn't go in with the idea that they weren't going to tell me the answers, and they told me the answers. A few years later, when I wrote Brewing with Wheat, that meant I talked to a lot of German brewers about the Weizen beers, and they were not giving me those answers. And I said, what is going on here? I went to the monastery breweries, and they're supposed to be secretive, and they would tell me exactly what they were doing. You guys won't. And that shamed some of them into giving me more information, but not every one of them.
Well, do you have some kind of body to introduce the brewers in Belgium?
To what's that?
You have some kind of a person that will introduce you to the brewers in Belgium?
Okay, so again, in some cases, some of the breweries, and in fact, they're in Seattle. Merchant de Vin is there in Seattle. Merchant de Vin imported Orval at the time and Westmalle. So they did those introductions for me. ACAS, that was a different importer for ACAS. But the two breweries that were considered really hard to get into, Rochefort and West Flatrin, in both of those cases, I wrote them letters, physical letters that you put in the mail, not email.
Oh, wow.
And explained to them what I was doing, that I wanted to write about the history of the monastery and why they made the beer as much as I wanted to write about the beer, which was true. And in both cases, I got replies, not written replies, by email, saying, okay, you would be at the brewery this day, and we'll show you around and talk to you and things like that. So again, it was just simply asking.
Nice. So that's nice that well, everybody could have tried to do that.
Right.
No, there is no shame in asking, right? So let's enter into a little bit technical aspects.
Okay.
We want to talk about 4 different Belgium styles, two ones that are very well known, and 2 others that not so much. We are talking specifically about Saison, Belgian Pale Ale, Potter's Beer, and Quadruple.
Okay.
So could you explain us very briefly which are the characteristics of each one of them?
Okay. So you want to start with Saison. And again, the Belgians would consider it a broad range. And I think brewers around the rest of the world. And real quickly, I'll go back to when you asked me about how the Belgians felt about beers from around the rest of the world. I think brewers, when they discover something interesting and they taste it and say, wow, this is really good, I want to make something like this, whatever you want to call it, they're intrigued and they want to learn more. And sometimes they're going to broaden the category. And that has certainly happened with Saison. And it also goes to the idea people are intrigued with doing it from a historical viewpoint, which means if you go back to before 1900, it was almost surely going to be a mixed fermentation. And of course, the best example is, the example everybody points to is Saison du Pont, and that has a certain amount of bunk in it as well. And a yeast strain that's really more than one strain, the one they have. If you buy the Saison du Pont strain, you're probably not going to get that mixed strain. So it's become a jumping off point for brewers to make beers with a lot more blending of of different products. They may age it in 2 or 3 different barrels and bring them together and still have it be a saison. So it is much broader. But in simplest terms, you're thinking about a beer that's going to be. So are we talking Plato or original gravity? Which do we prefer?
I think original gravity for
Okay,
me.
so yeah, but it can be a wide range, but people are generally trying to hit, say, in the mid 1050s to the mid between 1055 and 1065, but you can go beyond that, and then with a pretty fair amount of hop character, and part of it that is because if you think of Wallonia, which is where they originated, that water's high in bicarbonate, and that's going to give a natural snap to that. It really helps accent the hop character. If anything, if you were to start with Wallonian water, you're probably going to have to treat it to bring the pH down a little bit because it's pretty high pH. So you'd want a little bit lower, but not too much. So it's going to have a fair amount of hop character, and then it's really important that they be effervescent and really light on the tongue. So they're going to finish super dry. And particularly if you do a mixed fermentation, then it may get even drier. But if you were just to use one Saccharomyces, then you still would probably get it down to between 004 and 006. It wouldn't hurt to go a bit lower than that. If you finished it with something like Brettanomyces, then you're probably going to drop down to close to 0. So those are important aspects of the characteristic of that beer.
So, we are going to talk about a little about yeast in the next questions, but what about stale fermentation? There is some strains that are known for reaching a point of stale fermentation. They rest there for, I don't know, a week or a few weeks, and then they start again.
Oh, you mean it was diastaticus? That's a really, but that's I wouldn't say controversial. There's there are many. There's lots of new research going on to try and figure out how prominent that is in almost any yeast you get, because it's a potential problem. Because if you have ongoing fermentation, then of course you're building CO2, and you can end up with exploding bottles. It can also hurt the flavor as well. So there are both of those. So I think the goal is you want your yeast. You don't want diastaticus. That's basically because you can. There's been some thought that you need that to finish off the beer, but you can have plenty of yeast that finishes off without that being an issue. And the Belgian yeast are ones that will attenuate the beer more just naturally. They're closer to wine yeast. So if you go back and we go back more than 500 years, you can look at the family tree of yeast, and anybody wants to just Google family tree of yeast, and you can see the research that a lab in Kevin Versteppen's lab in Leuven and White Labs in the United States did to draw this family tree of yeast. And what they figured out is we go back about 500 or 600 years is when you have the yeast that the British use now, and therefore Americans use some, and some strains of the Belgian yeast. Those are POF negative. And it's kind of weird, the idea that that something, so we'll talk about phenolic off flavor positive, but an off flavor doesn't sound like it's positive. But that means that it is phenolic off flavor. Naturally, all yeast, if you took it, so you can go to your backyard and find yeast that will ferment maltose, which is what you want. You can find yeast that ferment lots of things, and you'd be excited and take it off of something. And they're really good at sugar, but they are not good at maltose. So you need something that's going to be good at maltose. You find those, they're always going to be phenolic off flavor. So if you just harvest yeast from your yard, it's going to make saison because it's going to be POF positive. But over time, 2 instances, somehow when people would take yeast, that was done fermenting, and they would take it to pass it on to the next beer, then they picked up some yeast that was POF negative. And then that they continue to use that POF negative. So the POF negative yeast is the, so that'd be whether you're talking about SO4, SO5, those are all POF negative. Almost every Belgian yeast is POF positive. And that's true of the Trappist yeast and the Abbey yeast. And so they have a lot, and that's also true of the German Weizen yeast. Those are also POF positive yeast. So those are all, and that's why you'll get some clove or pepper. And it certainly has to do with your mashing regime. And so what the environment you're creating for the yeast is what you want to think about. Don't think about, you never control your yeast. You work for your yeast. What you do for your yeast is create the environment that it wants to work in and give it the materials and the sugars and the maltose that it wants to chew on. So in the case of it was a German Weizen beer, you could use the Westmalle yeast for that. If you do a ferulic acid rest, then you're giving it more to create clove flavors. In the case of when you're thinking about making, so this would be true of saison, it'd be true of a Belgian triple. It's also true, it'll be true surprisingly of the quadruple that we talk about later, is you're going to mash at a lower temperature, so it makes it easier. You're going to get better attenuation. So you're creating that environment for it. So that's, the Belgian yeast are certainly different than the yeast that you would generally make a hazy IPA with, which of course that's probably going to be an English yeast that creates a different ester profile than an American yeast. Let's say American ale or Chico yeast.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, like summarizing, would you say that what makes so special the Belgian yeast would be the phenolic flavor gene?
Its ability to work at higher temperatures, like wine, so it doesn't crap out at the lower temperature. So it works really well for these beers because it's happy working at a higher temperature. It does not have to create off flavors. You screw up your fermentation, it will create off flavors, but it doesn't have to. It can make an 11% beer that's well attenuated. So that's part of the character. It also has some unique esters, but also it does have the phenolic off flavor, which gives you what we think about, that generally a saison or a triple, the Belgian beers, we talk about pepper more than we talk about clove.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you the pepper, which is the phenol.
Perfect. I think you touched it very superficially. Is the diastaticus variety a common thing in Belgian yeasts?
No, it hasn't been before.
Okay.
It does seem to, there's being more of a problem whether, what is being, so yeah, it's there. but it doesn't have to be. I guess that's the best way. If we went back 150 years, it probably was. But.
So if we dive deep into Saison style, it is known that brewers use different types of grain in this style. So it is mandatory to use like wheat or what is, I can remember the other cereal you take for breakfast.
Well, oats
Oats, yeah.
or
Oats,
spelt.
wheat,
Some people are using
spelt,
spelt.
yep.
But there are some Belgians doing it and some Belgians not doing it. People in the United States are doing it and not doing it. So it can change your mouthfeel. And you know, there's some other ancient grains you can use as well. They're interesting twists. They are not necessary. There's certainly nothing wrong with doing them. You want to be careful. You don't want to overdo it because it's probably going to change the mouthfeel.
Which you want it to be very light and thin.
Well, you know, yeah, as I said, you know, Saison's it's gonna finish dry. It's gonna finish like about 04 or something like that. So a little something that gives you, say, oats or spelt does that as well. It gives you this sensation of more body, even though it's pretty dry. It helps round it out. And the same thing's true with your choice of hops, because some hops have more polyphenols than others, and that's particularly it's a hop like Hersbrucker, for instance, which is a European hop, and there'd be a better chance that the Belgians would have used a hop like that. Used to be Strisselspalt, but Strisselspalt has just lowered the alpha acid so much, and that has a really nice spicy character as well. And those again just give you a little bit more texture in the mouth, because that's another hard to put your finger on it thing that Saison has, a bit of complexity.
Well, that's something that actually that's very new to me, like how you can actually change the mouthfeel by using different types of hops. Yeah, a very good information there. So would you say that every type of saison has to use some diastaticus yeast?
No.
It would be the norm, like if you go to, I don't know, white yeast or white labs, uh, if you buy any type of saison that they will normally be diastaticus?
No. You get in, like I said, you get into safety issues with that. So
Okay.
that would be a.
So we know that saison is a style that is very broad. We know we have some variations very dark, another are very pale, even some ones that show a little bit of acidity. So could you tell us about some examples of very weird saisons?
You know, that's a tricky thing, because I think then we get into this other area, excuse me, that which we're certainly seeing in the United States, which are sour barrel-aged beers, which I think no longer, you would not call them saisons anymore. So it's kind of hard. Some people are calling them saison. It might be saison at the base, and they may have started with the saison, but so I'm gonna just wait. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. You're back. You disappeared.
Oh,
Um,
I'm here.
the so I don't. In other words, if you went into that, if you became more like a Flanders Red, then you wouldn't call it a saison anymore. But you know, we see in the United States, we see people adding. You know, we're getting fruited saisons. Is that still a saison? I think the Belgians would think not.
Okay. So it's super easy to cross the border, trying to make a very
There's nothing wrong with crossing the border, but maybe you shouldn't call it a saison anymore.
exactly, yeah. So I think you touched this point about the water used for brewing saisons.
Right? They're pretty high in bicarbonate. That's it. So somewhat hard. Um,
Hmm.
and even you think about if you're making IPAs and how you would Burtonize water.
Hmm.
Um, when I wrote Brew Like a Monk, where I lived in New Mexico, my the bicarbonate level was almost exactly the same as Wallonia. So that made it really easy if I wanted to. Made it great for making IPAs and really nice for making saisons. Not so good for making triples. So I had to buy water at the store.
Perfect. Uh, would you use modern types of hops for a saison, like I don't know, Galaxy, for example, or Citra?
Uh, uh, I wouldn't, but many people are. There's a place I like those hops, and there's plenty of places for them. But I personally like the character that you get from the European hops, which are are a lot different. They don't have that same level of geranium. They don't have the same thiol, so you don't get a fruitiness. And I don't like masking. I really like the flavor of saison, so I'm probably not going to need additives to it. So
Mhm.
that's just sort of my view. Yes, people are using those hops, and then you would certainly, if you're going to use them and want to get that out of them, then you're going to want to think about using them either at the end of the boil or even as a dry hop during fermentation. So you're going to get the biotransformations from the yeast that you're using. And it's a tricky balance there because you got to remember those are also creating a different sort of ester profile than you're used to. If you say this is the way I make an IPA and I want to make a saison, you're going to certainly get some changes because of the yeast you're using.
Mhm. So, what about fermentation? It's important to the fermentation to reach very high temperatures, or is it important to start low and let it free rise? What about pitching rate, oxygenation rate?
So you want it well oxygenated. You want to create that super friendly environment for the yeast. um, so a pretty good pitching rate. You've seen people say I want to stress the yeast, and also and the carryover here is you look at the pitching rates of some of the Trappist monasteries. They're shockingly low. But Rochefort is more traditional, for instance. The low ones have to do with, first of all, they're very viable yeast. They're pitching, they're top cropping and going into the next batch. And then, of course, they're pitching multiple batches, so the yeast count's a little harder to talk about.
Hmm.
Um, but generally, so you want a good, and then, I mean, the number is 1 mil per 1 mil per mil per plato, which is a little tricky because um, then you'd have to convert that back to original gravity, which is basically divisible by 4, but higher numbers, it's a little bit different. Like 17 Plato is not 1068, it's more like 1066 and a half. Um, but a good healthy pitching rate. Um, then pitching rather cool into a cool environment. So, if it's living in an environment, I'll go back to, you want Fahrenheit here or Celsius?
I would say Celsius, maybe.
Okay. So you would say start at more like 16C, and in an environment of 16C, and just let it free rise. And it's going to add lots and lots of temperature. So on its own, it's going to take the temperature up. And the key thing is that those first couple days, or maybe the first 36 hours of fermentation, it's still going to be probably below 20C. So much of that fermentation is at a rather cool temperature, so you're not going to get the higher alcohols that give you a headache. And then after that, you just let it rip on up. And yeah, it may go 24, 25, and you shouldn't be concerned about that. Some of these saisons, DuPont, which there are different variations of. To get it to finish, you've got to get it super high. So it's not, you may have to introduce a little bit of heat yourself. One brewing scientist told me that theory is that at least DuPont, and when you can get the strain from DuPont, there's definitely more than one strain in there, and it's going to kick in to finish chewing on the maltose, the one strain, at a particular temperature. So if you reach that point in fermentation and you're not at that temperature, the yeast isn't going to work and it's not going to finish out. So that's a tricky thing about the higher temperature. And this is a little aside that we hadn't talked about. So people ask about higher temperatures, particularly the appeal if you don't have temperature control, about using the Kveik yeast from Norway. The Kveik yeast is not good for saison. The Kveik yeast is POF negative. So you're not going to get those nice spicy characters, although it does love to work at higher temp, and it will, attenuate like crazy and finish in 2 or 3 days. It's like this weird little animal, watching this hamster spin around a cage or something like that. But it is not a saison yeast. So
it's interesting that you touched that point because it's been so much hype about Quake yeast. I would say in the last year, but it's not a yeast that it's gonna be used for every style. So,
but you can use it for an incredible number of styles, rather than
yeah,
people think you don't have to just use it for Norwegian farmhouse, but the style you don't want to use it for is for saison.
maybe for some bisons as well.
No, not for Weizens either. You're correct.
Um so let's move on to Belgian Pale Ale and Patters beer. So, what about the grain bill in these types of beers?
Well, and so the Belgian pale is going to be more pale malt, less Pilsner malt. And the feeling is this is actually a beer that is born after World War II, because the Belgians were introduced to the British bitters. So it is sort of the Belgian version of that. And it's not as high a gravity. It doesn't, not quite as well attenuated. And it has a little different hop quality that's really hard to put your finger on. And it's really tricky if we talk specifically about the Belgian pales at the turn of this century. Since then, people are starting to take beers that are more like a Belgian blonde and call them Belgian pales. And that gets a little confusing because those beers are more Pilsner malt. But if you're going to say traditionally, if you're brewing it for a style, for a competition, then more pale malt, and certainly literally a little bit more of a British character, although you're going to use a Belgian yeast. So you're not, you want to restrain the esters, so you're not going to let it ferment as at high a temperature, and what gets tricky about that is without the esters, then the phenols become more prominent, and you don't. This is a pretty balanced beer. You don't want it to be a lot of anything. That's about.
So that was one part of the questions to dive deep into it. It's POG positive yeast still used in this style?
That's POF,
POF,
and
sorry.
it, it, it's yes, it is POF positive, but it's not as assertive as some of the others.
And what about the Potter's beer? It's still common that Belgian breweries still produce this style?
Well, you've got two things going on. So it's a monastery beer that's made for the monks. And at each brewery, it's different if it's made at all. Rochefort used to, they don't anymore. West Flat Run used to make one, then they changed it, so it's a 6-degree beer, so it's a little bit stronger. That one's really hoppy, the one with the green label, very hoppy, and it really shows. They're letting the hardness of their water show off as well. So those I wouldn't necessarily call Pater's beers. So you've got at West Mall, it's called Extra, and in that case, that's about a 5% beer, all Pilsner malt, all Saaz hops. Really simple. Still using the West Mall yeast, however. So you are going to get some spicy character from it, and that's the one. Usually, when people in the homebrewers in the United States, that's the beer they're striving for.
And is it possible to still use some sort of other fermentable as sugar?
You in the case of the West Mall Extra, they do not use sugar. So the two other examples are Chimay, Doré, and that beer is spiced and is lower alcohol. And then Orval, and Orval's beer is simply a watered down Orval. They take Orval, they add water to it, but it's lower, so it's like Orval. But in this case, because it's generally not aged. It's the Brettanomyces is not going to come through. So people are shocked. If you go to Belgium and Orval, it used to be a Orval. They did not release that. They aged the beer at the brewery, so it always had the Brettanomyces character. But 15 years ago, they began thereabouts releasing it young. So you get a Orval at a month old, and at that point you go, this is a really hoppy beer. And where's the Brettanomyces? It's because it hasn't kicked in. But in the case of the little beer, it's like I said, it's just a watered down Orval. So those are all examples of the Pater's beer. For people making them, what the people in the United States making them, then they're tending towards like West Mall, which again is about a 5% beer with just a ton of flavor. It's a great beer, and it really showcases Pilsner malt and Saaz hops. And you would go, that seems like a lot of the same things that I get in a Pilsner from Germany or the Czech Republic, but you end up with a much different beer because of the use of the yeast, and then also because they're not trying to wring as much flavor out of the malt.
Would you say that Pater's beer could support aging, or how good would they hold?
I the Orval is certainly going to age. It has the Brettanomyces, and the Chimay has the spices, but they were not brewed with that intention. They're brewed with the idea that this would be the beer that the monks drank. So it was kind of the regular beer. So
Yeah.
And I would not. That beer is better fresh, although they only brew it a couple times a year. So
It,
you might have it when it's 5 months old, and it's still pretty good.
is it seasonal?
Uh, no.
It's year round. The monks drinks every year, every day of the year.
They don't drink every day of the year, but yeah.
Cool. So the last style, it would be quadruple. So an style that apparently has a high complexity of malts, but most Belgian brewers make them with actually a very simple grain bill.
Well, the two parts of that, this beer was traditionally not called quadruple. Latrop / Königshaven started calling theirs quadruple, and then lots of other people called theirs quadruple. Within the Trappist monasteries, they were just strong darks. They just called them. West at Rochefort it was the 8 or the 10. At West Flat Run, the 8 or the 10. At Chimay, the blue. So it's sort of tricky that way, but they did not call it quadruple, but that is the beer that you're shooting for, and their recipes are really simple. Um, uh, the idea, Rochefort, they would say we use 2 malts. Well, they use more than that. But a lot of that character was coming from the dark syrup, which we've talked about earlier. So that adds lots and lots. The unfermentables in there add lots of the complexity and can add a lot of the color as well.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to even what are even called the Abbey beers, people were more likely to use multiple malts. And then, of course, in the United States, homebrewers like to use lots and lots of malts. Many of those homebrewers became commercial brewers. So examples made in the United States might have 5 or 6 different, people. They'll use 2 different Munich malts and some special B and some Cara Munich, all kinds of different mishmashes and things like that. And if you let them age long enough, they'll come together. So those beers, quite often to me, are best when they're more than a year old. And if you're a home brewer, you can do that. If you're a commercial brewery, you want to sell your beer now, which is the interest of the Belgian, whether you're in a monastery or otherwise. They're making beer for people to drink. If you want to lay it down yourself, that's okay. But they want it to be ready to drink now. So they get a lot of, but if you age those beers, they will become more complex. But you can get those. That's the wonder of those beers. You can get tremendously complex flavors, relatively young beer with a very simple grain bill.
So I think we touched the use of candy sugar.
Right.
So I think we can
I
skip
think
that
we had
one.
a question come in. I saw somebody across what you can do when you cannot get the dark syrups. You can make
That's
your
right.
own, and not so there's a recipe for that in Brew Like a Monk, and there's also a recipe for that in Randy Mosher's book Radical Brewing, which
Perfect.
is, and that Radical Brewing is translated into they'll do a lot of good, is translated into Portuguese now, a little bit closer.
Is it important the mashing in this type of beers of full body? Some might could try to mash at a higher temperature to leave a lot of residual sugar.
Now, you don't. These are not beers that end up with a lot of residual sugar. You're getting your complexity from the malts and what flavor is in there. Most of these beers are going to finish at 1008 or less.
Wow.
So you're still either doing if you're doing now this conversion, I don't remember. I should what it is C, but Fahrenheit, you're mashing at maybe 146 Fahrenheit, or you're doing the traditional step like the Belgians do, but you are mashing for fermentability. You're getting the flavors not from having a lot of residual sugar left.
Perfect. So, can you tell us a little more about that step mash?
Boy, I don't remember. Let's see. Trying to remember 35, 45, 55 maybe. So, I mean, and again, I hate to say go by the book, but I don't remember the step temperature. But basically, you're doing about 3 temperatures, but you're going to skip the lower one. So you don't want to actually that'd be 45. So you wouldn't do the 45C because that's going to raise your ferulic acid. So that's different than say a German schedule.
Mm-hmm.
But you really the way malts are modified now, you don't need to do that. A single mash, then runoff. Don't make it super hot for the runoff, so you're going to continue to clear through your runoff. You're going to get a highly fermentable beer.
Perfect. Um, so I'm a home brewer or I'm a craft brewer, and I'm willing to have some yeast to be available for me at all time. So which one would be completely a must?
Um, so this is sort of a matter of preference. Some people will prefer the Westmalle yeast, which you can get from White Labs. I think it's 530, or Y yeast, which is like 1087. And I mean, it's not a secret anymore what their sources are. I personally like the Ardennes yeast, and I'm trying to remember what the number of that one is. Might be 550, but maybe not. But that's a matter of personal preference. You got to be careful with that. When it's young, it really you can get a lot of banana, but it'll kind of age out. So it's the Yashuf yeast as well. When I say Ardennes yeast, it's the Yashuf yeast. And strangely, I'm not a fan of many of the Yashuf beers. I really like their yeast. So those can be with the Chimay yeast that you can get. The Chimay yeast to me has too much banana, and the banana just stays. It won't go away. But what I advocate is experiment with the yeast. When you find one you like, say this is it. Don't say I'm going to do it with Westmalle yeast this time and Chimay yeast this time. And it's really hard to use the Rochefort yeast. So I would, unless you're brave, I would not mess with that one. So my preference is a Yashuf/Ardennes yeast.
Perfect. And in the case of beers with a really high gravity, it would be necessary to use some kind of nutrients.
Not if you pitch enough yeast, not if you've fermented for the proper fermentability. I mean, mash for the proper fermentability. I don't see the need to use nutrients. For one thing, you're not, these beers don't go past like 1096. And for the most, I mean, you could make a really nice triple. We didn't talk about triple. So you would use more with the strong dark, but a strong dark at 1088. So if you're 1088, for instance, I just sort of threw that number out there, and you get it down to 1010, then you've got a beer that's well over 10%. So if you start at 88 down to 8, again, you're going to have 11% beer. So you're not going to these crazy high levels of original gravity.
Perfect. And oxygenation has a major role in these high gravity Belgian beers.
But yeah, I think everything should be well oxygenated.
Yeah.
So that's
Cool. Bottle conditioning. Uh, is it important to
absolutely
have
essential
a
for the Trappist beers.
Re-fermentation in bottles?
Correct. And for it adds a level of complexity, but also it's the only way. These beers need to be, 7.5 grams per liter to 8 grams per liter, or which is the same as 3.5 volumes to 4 volumes, as opposed to, if you're making an IPA, that's probably going to be 2.5 volumes. So they are much, much more carbonated, and you need to do that in the bottle, because you're not going to be able to create it otherwise.
And how critical is to introduce a new healthy yeast for bottle conditioning?
Well, I think it's almost always necessary. For one reason, I'm an advocate of long lagering of these beers, of knocking them down to basically 0C, 0 or 1C, for a good length of time. So you get some natural clarity in the beer, without any filtering or anything like that, but it just happens. And when you do that, you let the yeast settle out, and you need to reintroduce more yeast. Generally, I like Chris White of White Labs would say, you're just looking for a small handful. I don't think most of us think in those terms. And as they've made your smack packs and the packs that White Lab does, they keep packing with more yeast. It's made a little bit harder. You seem to need less and less. But I like starting with the fresh yeast, and you can use some of that yeast, and I just have a feel for how much of it is for what's going to mount. At the time, I'm going to have a little over 4 gallons generally, because I've transferred a few times. So I know about how much yeast I need for that, and then I can use the rest of it and just pitch it up 1 or 2 times to make a starter after that.
It would be too critical to overshoot the yeast in bottle conditioning?
You don't really want to overshoot it. And what you're really looking for is one mil per mil, but that's really hard to measure. You just want it, it's going to be a sliver on the bottom. Part of it is when you get higher CO2 in the bottle and you open the bottle, it's naturally going to kick some up. So you don't want a lot of yeast coming back in, because it looks ugly. The flavor isn't such a big deal. So if you don't kick a lot off, and then you can pour it off of it. So that's a practical reason, and you don't really need it with that. You're putting that in, and of course you're adding that as well as sugar. So
So a lot of experimentation there.
yeah, you begin to learn what works for you, or if you have the ability to measure it, then you can measure it.
So normally, how do they do these types of beer age with time? I mean, a lot of brewers in Latin America are used to have them with with a few months old. So what's the difference between that age or having them just next to the brewery in Belgium, very fresh?
Well, like the quads, that they're going to work fine. Be a little bit more oxidized, maybe, but it's going to add more dark fruit character, more complexity. So in the case of quads, they age quite nicely. To back up one more thing about the re-fermentation in the bottle, I like the approach, and this changes. This is a Weiss brewery. So Schneider Weiss in Germany, but I think their approach is a pretty good way to do it, because when you re-ferment in the bottle, you've got to make sure you're doing an actual diacetyl rest, because you've reintroduced yeast and you get in sugar. And if you let it in and go along, and then you cool it down too quickly, it doesn't have time. You don't have the diacetyl rest. So the way Schneider does it is their re-fermentation in the bottle for their Weiss beers is about 2 weeks at be maybe 21C, I guess, and then drops down to 55, which is like 12 to 14, somewhere in there. So a couple days, a couple times warm, and that takes you clear through the diacetyl rest, and then drop it down one more warm before you let the beer cool. And it makes for really nice, fine, tight bubbles, and that's an important part.
Perfect. We were talking as well about the difference between fresh styles. So what about saisons? Would they change that much with age?
Well, because there's such a broad range, it's kind of hard to say. But if you made a really hoppy one, then yeah, you're going to lose some of the hop character. And if you use some of these New World hops, like we talked about, like say Galaxy or Citra, you're going to lose some there. If you dry hop, then you may lose some of that character and that fresh hop character. But that's a function of it being a hoppy beer, not so much the saison. Saisons age pretty, you're not going to lay it down for years, but yeah, you can put some time on them. It's got a fair amount of alcohol. Alcohol lets beer age longer.
Mm-hmm. And we are reaching to the last of our pre-search research questions.
Okay.
So this one has to do with the lack of liquid yeast in some of the markets in Latin America. So, is there any good alternative using dry yeast?
They're definitely getting better. And I think both, Fermentus and Lallemand, I don't remember the number. Sometimes it's like 32 or something, but yes, there are good, much better choices from them than there were 5, 6 years ago, I would say.
And what do you think about reusing dry yeast?
I don't have enough experience uh, with it to say, and there are a number of breweries, and I mean I know a number of commercial brewers who use dry yeast, but they don't reuse it. Doesn't mean they couldn't reuse it, but the dry yeast it's the price point is fine, and it's easy for them to go ahead and use fresh all the time, so they're not reusing it. So sort of your goal is, what you really want to do is have a good source for liquid yeast and keep using it. So, and be willing to pass it around with friends who might keep it going as well. And it'd be nice if somebody in there owns a microscope.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I'm gonna start reading the questions that the audience left in the chat room.
Okay.
So one of them is actually very interesting. It's since Belgium used to be a part of the Netherlands, is there any Dutch style in the shadows?
Well, yeah, the feeling is that you get in things like the Flanders Red, you get a Dutch influence there. I would say the wit beers, definitely. It's the hard thing about this is, so they're all lowlands beers before. So any beer that goes back in arguably the Lambic beers are, they predate Belgium becoming Belgium. But I don't, and you could see similarities with some of the beers around Amsterdam. Anytime you get in a mixed fermentation beer, then there are going to be some similarities. But style, it's something we call a style. I don't think necessarily so.
Cool. There is other one about the candy sugar. You already talk about one of the recipes that is in your Brew Like a Monk or the Radical Brewing from Randy. But this guy asked precisely about using sugar and citric acid to make inverted sugar.
There are people who use inverted sugar, which is okay, and it adds nice flavor. I think of it as a British thing, and it's certainly an alternative, but it's not going to give you the exact same thing as the confectionery sugar. And quite honestly, the recipes, which is Randy's modified recipe in my book, it's still not going to give you the same thing as the confectionery sugars. I mean, the confectionery syrups. So you realize that, I mean, so at Westmall, for their Double, which is their dark beer, they don't have a stronger one than that. They actually have a silo with this liquid sugar in it. And you know, that's their source, is from people who are making for baking and candy. It has a unique flavor.
Mhm. Any tips for brewing beer de garde? And how does it really taste in Belgium?
Well, it's in France, and you have beers that are much like saison, and then you have beers that are much like strange lagers to me. Quite honestly, I hate judging that style because I don't quite understand what it's supposed to taste like. You know, when I started home brewing 30 years ago, the examples of beer de garde, you would go, you get this thing. Well, basically, what you were smelling was moldy cork. The idea that they had this sort of cellarish character, you know, it was just the cork. So that you had your sense that that's what's supposed to be different about them. Um, I think thinking about using a lager yeast with with the same sort of grain bill and what you're shooting for in a beer de garde, in a saison, is interesting, but I don't know if you end up with a beer de garde.
Cool. Uh, I think we have very few questions left. Somebody asked about the use of wheat flour.
Flour. Yeah, so so the two parts of that are, there is a tiny bit of that in Rochefort. You know, I'm not, and there may not be anymore. So Gumer Santos is a brewing engineer in charge of the brewing at Rochefort. And you know, when he took over the brewing, he looked and he said, "I'd really like to quit using this. We don't need this." And he may have over time. And then they have used it in the past at Chimay. So it's just gives you another uh, what ends up being a fermentable like sugar. Um, and they use it at Chimay, but my understanding is they don't anymore. It's not going to make your beer more authentic. It's just something else that,
Mm-hmm.
and also if you're trying to calculate your gravity and understandable, it adds it's much more variable than sugar, so it makes your brewing day a little bit more difficult.
Uh, so this one, what is the main characteristic to focus when trying to differentiate a Belgian Golden Strong against a triple?
Triple spicier. That's about it's a really and so in terms of what anybody talks about in Golden Strong, they're talking about Duvel. That has come to define the style for people. Even though other people in Belgium make Golden Strongs that are quite a bit different than Duvel. They're not nearly as attenuated. So they're much sweeter beers. They have a higher starting gravity, a higher finishing gravity. And Hedvig Neven is the brewing director at Duvel. And what he told me, he said, one of those breweries thought, well, Duvel sells more than us. We're going to try and become more like Duvel. So they lowered their starting gravity, their finishing gravity, made a dry brewed beer. It hurt their sales. Wasn't as good as Duvel. People will go, it's not Duvel. And now it wasn't different than Duvel. So they went back to making the different beer than Duvel. But if we think of Duvel as that style, then it is a beer that's lagered a long time. So it's really got that smoothness. And so it doesn't have that same spicy character that that you get in, say, the West Malt Triple. I also think that some of that spicy character probably comes from your hop choices. So if you use something more like a Styrian Golding, which is Styrian Golding is really the same as Fuggle, as opposed to Saaz, which gives you, or Tettnanger, which give you a more spicy character to it. So it's the combination of that longer lagering, a little bit of the yeast, and a little bit of hop character.
Cool. So we have two more questions. I think actually we already touched the first one. It's just how important is the bottle conditioning? You already told that it's very important. And how much time Belgian breweries condition their beer? It's nearly zero because they want to sell that beer.
Well, yeah, well, they're the bottling conditioning takes 3 weeks generally. Then, like at Rochefort, which sells a 6, 8, and 10. So the monk who used to be in charge of brewing there told me that. So the idea was the 6 would be ready to sell 6 weeks after you bottled it, or ready to drink 6 weeks after you bottle it. The 8 weeks after you bottle it, and they stamp the bottling date right. Well, they stamp the best by date on the top, but you can discount backwards. So at the 8 at 8 weeks, and the 10 at 10 weeks. West Flat Vernon has to do with the sales, but the two parts of it. So theirs may have been sitting around a while before it gets sold. But yeah, they are not generally selling their cellaring their beer for a long time before they sell it.
Perfect. And what type of yeast do the Trappist monastery use for bottle conditioning? Do they use the same primary fermentation yeast, or do they add another type of cleaner yeast?
It's the same yeast, it's a top cropped yeast. So at West Flat Run again would be the example, which they're the only ones that still have open fermentation. They are timing making new batches so they can scoop yeast off of an ongoing, which will be billowing at the top. They can scoop that off and use that for bottle conditioning. So everybody's using the same yeast that they used in for primary, because they've got an ongoing primary with good healthy yeast in it.
Easier to just have one strain of yeast.
Yes.
And what about the Brettanomyces, like in Orval? Do they add Brettanomyces at bottling, or it's just the...
Orval's the only one that uses Brettanomyces, and it used to be that they would add that when they dry hopped. And I think maybe the way I describe it in Brew Like a Monk, because they changed it, like the inline maybe changed it in 2006. And in that case, they add Brettanomyces inline during bottling. It's very high tech.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, I think we reached to the end of the questions. One more time, we really appreciate it that you could take the time to have this chat with us.
Great.
Enjoy a little time while being at home, safe at home.
Oh yeah. Well, yes, I'm spending a lot of time at home. So I'll make my my beer run Friday. Each Friday, I try to go to a different local brewery. They're selling beer at their curbside, so go pick up beer for the next week and wave at the brewer from a long distance away.
Sure. Well, thanks again, Stan. It's
Thanks for
been
inviting me.
a real pleasure to host this podcast. Well, thank you, and I start speaking in Spanish again to just can say goodbye.
So that brewery, by the way, is Diamond Knot. Look for Diamond Knot, which you should be able to get their beer in Seattle as well. They
Perfect.
made a really nice Hefeweizen. I don't know if they do anymore.
Cool. I'm looking for a white wine. I know I have already a few of them.
Yeah. That's definitely seasonal one-time beers for people.
Actually, it was called November Rain.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Stan.
Okay.
Bueno, chicos, hemos contestado a todas las preguntas que hemos tenido, las que habíamos recopilado de las redes sociales y las que pudimos recopilar aquí del chat. Espero haya sido una sesión de harto de aprendizaje y que esta charla haya podido tener también un poquito de alegría, traerles alegría y un momento cervecero en sus casas. Faltaron dos preguntas, creo que no las... ¿Cuáles serían esas dos preguntas? Uh, okay, so I think actually I missed two questions, so do you
Okay.
mind if we go?
Okay. If they aren't too hard.
Yeah, so alternative grains in Belgian beers, actually, what is the most common?
Well, what
And
people I would say unmalted wheat.
and well, this guy actually really specify very rare ones like buckwheat or quinoa.
Well, I would say spelt and then buckwheat.
Cool. And what about using honey to increase the sugar content, for example, a quadruple?
It's okay, but it does add a variable because you don't know exactly how much sugar is in that honey.
Uh,
But it can
so
add a little bit of complexity. But you got to it can change your gravity a little bit. It's not that big a deal, but it should ferment out fine. You won't get lots of honey. It's because these are pretty flavorful yeast and you've got a lot of alcohol in there. I don't know how much honey, but it can add a nice little complex note. To me, it works better in a triple than it does a quad.
perfect. Okay, so once again, thank you very much, Stana. It's been my
Okay,
pleasure.
sure.
And bueno, ahí contestamos las últimas dos preguntas. Agradecemos a todos de nuevo la presencia. Esperamos que haya sido un momento agradable y los seguimos invitando para las siguientes sesiones. Fabián, creo que va a tomar la palabra para dar las palabras finales.
Sí, muchas gracias, Gustavo. Thank you so much, Stan. Y
you.
bueno, lo dejamos invitado a todos nuevamente a las próximas sesiones. El día de mañana iniciaremos con una clínica de Sour Beers, a la cual pueden buscar su información enviándonos un correo a fabian@academiacervecera.org o pueden ingresar a las redes sociales de ACAS, tanto en el Instagram como en el Facebook. También durante el día viernes se estará publicando la cuarta semana de entrevistas académicas, así que desde ya los dejamos a todos invitados a participar. Thank you so much again, Stan, and really thank for your time and for the really I enjoy this interview. And this interview is published in 1 week more in YouTube.
Okay.
For the free for all people. So thanks and bye.
Okay, bye. Okay.